Welcome to this video about whether war can be morally justified. I'll be addressing this topic from the perspective of Pope Leo XIV's encyclical Magnifica Humanitas, which was released in May of 2026. I'll cover off what the Church teaches about just war theory, how it has been applied in recent times, and whether any war in the age of AI can be morally justified. Hi, I'm Rick Sabisiak, and I think this topic is quite pertinent in the context of today's world, and I felt it would be helpful to put together some content that will hopefully spark reflection, some thought, and discussion. But before launching into it, I'll try to clarify a couple of concepts. To start, let's look at what is meant by the term just war. You can think of just war as a morally justified military intervention. So let's use the start of World War II as an example. In September of 1939, Poland was invaded by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The Poles tried to defend themselves in what was clearly to them, and of course many others, a justified military action. They were fighting off invading forces trying to take over their homeland. In contrast, one can make a strong case that the invading Nazi and Soviet forces were engaging in what was not a morally justified military action, one focused on aggression and power. Whenever you have a war between nations, the question of the moral justification for each side arises. Countries always seem to claim to be morally justified in their military actions. We'll be unpacking what it really means to be morally justified in entering into war. One additional thing I'll offer as background is what exactly is meant by an encyclical. Think of an encyclical as a document issued by the Pope to guide, to teach, and clarify important matters of faith, morals, or contemporary society. One example of an encyclical is Rerum Novarum, which is Latin for revolutionary change. It was issued by Pope Leo XIII in 1891 during the Industrial Revolution. It addressed the incredible changes happening at the time and focused on defending workers' rights, as well as supporting fair wages and trade unions. It also criticized both unregulated capitalism and communism. More recently, Pope Francis issued the encyclical Laudato Si, subtitled On Care for Our Common Home. It called on people to combat climate change, reject consumerism, and protect the earth and the poor. The most recent encyclical, and the one I'll be focusing on in this video, is Magnifica Humanitas, which means magnificent humanity, and it was issued by Pope Leo XIV on May the 15th of 2026. And I found this encyclical to be quite inspiring. Although some call it Pope Leo XIV's AI encyclical, I think it covers much broader territory. It examines deeper questions of what it means to be human, how we organize our societies, and how we protect the vulnerable today. Magnifica Humanitas has received widespread coverage, not just in Catholic circles, but in wider circles, even secular media. I've come across commentary about it in all sorts of places that surprised me, as well as in mainstream media. It covers a lot of territory, and I've chosen to focus on one specific aspect of it, what Pope Leo XIV has to say about just war theory. So let's begin by going through a quote from the encyclical. Today, more than ever, without prejudice to the right to self-defense in the strictest sense, it is important to reaffirm that the just war theory, which has all too often been used to justify any kind of war, is now outdated. Humanity possesses far more effective and capable tools for promoting human life and resolving conflicts, such as dialogue, diplomacy, and forgiveness. The use of force, violence, and weapons reflects a relational poverty that always has disastrous consequences for civilian populations. So, what does the Catholic Church teach about just war, the just war theory that Pope Leo XIV just referenced in that quote? The discussion of just war comes from the section of the Catechism of the Catholic Church called Safeguarding Peace and the subsection Avoiding War. It leads with a discussion about peace being the default stance. Specifically, all citizens and all governments are obliged to work for the avoidance of war. However, as long as the danger of war persists and there is no international authority with the necessary competence and power, governments cannot be denied the right of lawful self-defense once all peace efforts have failed. The just war framework is not about justifying warfare. It's focused on strictly limiting and regulating legitimate self-defense once all peace efforts have failed. The Catechism of the Catholic Church goes on to state that these are the traditional elements enumerated in what is called the just war doctrine. The damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. All other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. There must be serious prospects of success. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modern means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition. So again, that's from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, section 2309. Now, in addition, how war is carried out matters as well. So again, citing the Catechism, the mere fact that war has regrettably broken out does not mean that everything becomes illicit between the warring parties. The non-combatants, wounded soldiers, and prisoners must be respected and treated humanely. Every act of war directed to the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities or vast areas with their inhabitants is a crime against God and man, which means firm and unequivocal condemnation. A danger of modern warfare is that it provides the opportunity to those who possess modern scientific weapons, especially atomic, biological, or chemical weapons, to commit such crimes. And note the emphasis on prudential judgment in the following quote from the Catechism. The evaluation of these conditions for moral legitimacy belongs to the prudential judgment of those who have responsibility for the common good. So, in other words, entering into war is not a formulaic, algorithmic-based determination. It requires deep prudential human judgment. Now, as with all challenging moral questions, just war decisions cannot be decided by a yes-no checklist. Just war criteria are a guide for deep discernment. They're designed to trouble and not clear the conscience of leaders. They ask some really hard questions. Now, where do these just war principles come from? Did they just come out of thin air at some point in time? Well, the basic instincts stem from ancient Greece and Rome. And St. Augustine then was faced with some challenges for figuring out when war is relevant back when he was a bishop. So he's the theological father of just war back in the 4th and 5th centuries. St. Thomas Aquinas, as St. Thomas Aquinas tends to do, he codified a very structured, logical framework for it back in the 13th century. It was formally entered into the Catholic Catechism in the 16th century and has also been encoded in secular international law starting in the 16th century. Now, modern day just war doctrine entered into the Catechism of the Catholic Church in the 20th century. So that's just a very quick overview. I didn't want to dive too far into the weeds there. Now, you may be wondering how this sort of doctrine develops over time. Like, shouldn't there be a concrete moral stance that, once defined and rooted in Scripture, persists over time? To answer this question, I'll defer to St. John Henry Newman's work on development of Christian doctrine, from which we have this quote. In a higher world, it is otherwise. But here below, in other words, in our world, to live is to change. And to be perfect is to have changed often. One of my favorite quotes. So he has 7 tests of authentic development, including, for example, preservation of principles, assimilation but not subversion, anticipation of the future. So I won't go through all of them in detail, but this approach to development of doctrine helps keep the church relevant to the questions of the time while maintaining its tradition. And it is something that the Catholic Church has been doing for the past 2,000 years. Now, does just war doctrine mean that leaders need to cave in to the demands of aggressors? Does it mean we become doormats? So let's take a look at the going back in history to the appeasement of Hitler. So some have argued that British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's appeasement policies towards Hitler enabled rather than prevented the widespread scale of World War II. So from a blind appeasement perspective, when trying to negotiate with an actor totally unmoored from international law and principles of justice, such as Hitler-type people, continuing to negotiate does not preserve peace and encourages aggression. So, for example, the Western Allies forced Czechoslovakia to cede the Sudetenland to Hitler in 1938, sacrificing the security and sovereignty of a democracy to buy a temporary false peace. And that didn't turn out very well and certainly didn't appease Hitler in terms of his ongoing aggression. Now let's take a look at meaningful diplomacy and negotiation. This refers to all reasonable and viable means of avoiding war being exhausted in order to justify a just war. If it becomes clear that an actor is negotiating in bad faith and has an underlying intention to achieve aggressive expansion, the negotiation is no longer reasonable and viable. So just war doctrine calls for meaningful diplomacy and negotiation rather than appeasement at all costs. Now let's take a look at how just war has been applied recently, beginning with Pope John Paul II and the Iraq War. So at the outset of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, Pope John Paul II argued against what was being put forward as a preemptive strike. The Bush administration claimed a preemptive strike against Iraq was needed to eliminate potential weapons of mass destruction. John Paul II rejected this, arguing that a war can only be considered just if it is strictly defensive, authorized by international law through the UN, and waged as an absolute last resort. And he even sent a personal papal rep to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Bush to argue that a unilateral preemptive invasion would be morally unjustified. To quote him, "No to war. War is not always inevitable. It is always a defeat for humanity. International law, honest dialogue, solidarity between states, the noble exercise of diplomacy, these are the methods worthy of individuals and nations in resolving their differences." Pope Benedict XVI succeeded John Paul II as Pope and held a senior position during the pontificate of John Paul II. And specifically, he was responsible for promoting and defending Catholic doctrine on faith and morals for the 24 years before becoming Pope. And before and during his papacy, Pope Benedict XVI expressed profound skepticism about how easily modern nations invoke just war theory to legitimize military campaigns, and even whether a just war with current generation weapons is legitimate. To quote him back when he was a cardinal before becoming Pope, "Given the new weapons that make possible destructions that go beyond the combatant groups, today we should be asking ourselves if it is still licit to admit the very existence of a just war." So back in 2003, there was already the question raised at the highest levels of whether a just war is actually licit in today's day and age. Now let's take a look at the question of whether the US-Israeli attack on Iran in 2026 is a just war. So first of all, let's consider what Cardinal Robert McElroy, the Archbishop of Washington, D.C., has to say on the matter. Now, he's something who knows a thing or two about just war theory. He's got a PhD in political science from Stanford University in 1989. His doctoral dissertation was Morality in American Foreign Policy, the Role of Moral Norms in International Affairs. He has a doctorate in moral theology from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome in 1986. And he's written various articles, books, has taken on various roles related to peace, justice, and the humanitarian impacts of war. So based on an interview with him, the criterion of a just cause is not met in the case of this attack on Iran because the United States was not responding to an existing or imminent and objectively verifiable attack by Iran, close quote. The cardinal referenced Pope Benedict XVI, who rejected the concept of preventative war. From a right intention perspective, he said, our goals and intentions are absolutely unclear, ranging from the destruction of Iran's conventional and nuclear weapons potential to the overthrow of its regime, to the establishment of a democratic government, to unconditional surrender. It was all over the place. From a proportionality perspective, it is far from clear that the benefits of this war will outweigh the harm which will be done. Now, turning to this age of AI, is any war in this age of AI defensible as a just war? So Pope Benedict has already questioned the legitimacy of a just war in the modern age, and now let's layer AI on top of modern weaponry and take a look at where that leaves us. Now, to answer that question, a good place to start is to understand how AI impacts how countries enter into war and how war is carried out. One key factor is the seduction of speed that AI brings to the table. So AI seduces military and civilian leaders with speed of execution meant to outpace adversaries. When AI gives the illusion of compiling all relevant decision-making information in one place, the temptation for humans is to automate the next move. However, the human process of weighing ethical consequences and exercising compassion is squeezed out of the timeline. And what is squeezed out of the timeline is that which makes us human rather than automatons. Critical human virtues, mercy, forgiveness, empathy, compassion, moral responsibility, and all these other dimensions of being human are systematically squeezed out of the timeline. Even though humans know they're dealing with AI, human judgment tends to defer to AI. When AI generates a highly confident recommendation, humans will often defer to it, especially in high-pressure situations. Humans are reduced to a rubber stamp in decision-making about lethal actions. A simplified example here is if a field commander is told she or he has a 30-second window to strike an enemy target, and the recommendation from AI is to proceed with the strike because it is likely to achieve the objectives of the campaign, is that commander likely to accept the recommendation? Furthermore, what if the commander's instincts about civilian casualties cannot be addressed in that 30-second window? Will the commander be willing to put her or his reputation on the line? Another factor is disconnecting military intelligence, which is a highly skilled profession, from life or death situations. Traditionally, military intelligence analysts spend hours analyzing nuanced data that, for example, differentiate whether an individual is a civilian, a child, or non-hostile. With AI automation, you can lose the checks where human compassion and critical thinking reside. Going back to Magnifica Humanitas and what Pope Leo XIV has to say, sometimes there is talk of artificial moral agents as if machines were able to distinguish between right and wrong with greater consistency than a human being. Yet moral judgment cannot be reduced to calculation, for it involves conscience, personal responsibility, and the recognition of the other as a person. Therefore, it is not permissible to entrust lethal or otherwise irreversible decisions to artificial systems. No algorithm can make war morally acceptable. AI does not remove the intrinsic inhumanity of conflict. Indeed, it can only bring about conflict more quickly and render it more impersonal, lowering the threshold for resorting to violence, transforming defense into threat prediction, and thus reducing victims to data. Overall, human values and morality are easily subordinated rather than being prioritized most highly. In the world of AI and algorithms, what matters most are objectives such as efficiency, speed of execution, and probability of success. And that leaves very little room, if any, for critical human values. Now, what exactly are these critical human values? Let's explore that in more detail. There are many human values, virtues, attributes that are outside of AI, and they cannot be inherently experienced through AI. For example, let's take a look at the area of human relationality, human connectedness. Now, this refers to empathy and compassion, our ability to resonate with another person's pain or suffering. Mercy and forgiveness, the conscious moral decision to spare an enemy combatant who has surrendered, failed, or ceased to pose an active threat. Shared vulnerabilities, the realization that, hey, you know what, that person is like me. And this historically acts as a natural brake on gratuitous violence. Another area is that of human morality. Conscience and remorse brings the psychological and spiritual burden of taking a life into the equation. Human combatants carry conscience and remorse, which acts as a deterrent against excess. AI experiences no such moral friction. Proportionality helps determine whether collateral damage is excessive, something that requires a qualitative value judgment. AI converts human life and strategic value into rigid mathematical ratios. And finally, honor and chivalry. That refers to these unwritten codes of conduct and restraint that prevent total war. For example, respecting truces and ceasefire agreements and respecting unwritten norms among combatants. There are many other human values that come into play in wartime situations that live outside of AI. Epistemic humility, that's the human capacity to say things like, I'm not sure, so I'm going to withhold fire. Machine learning models output confidence scores, and that's not always all that accurate. It can mask high-risk false positives behind misleading statistical certainty. De-escalation and restraint. Experienced humans can recognize opportunities to de-escalate tension through strategic pause, subtle signals, or non-lethal posturing. Intuition and gut instinct refers to the human ability to recognize various cues, anomalies, and atmosphere to pause an action when something feels wrong, even if data suggests otherwise to AI. Now, there are many other human values and virtues that come into the picture in times of war, but hopefully this gives you a feel for what is squeezed out of the picture when we relegate decisions to AI and autonomous actors. The key point here is that humans are more than material beings. We're more than just a pile of atoms that can be understood and replicated through AI large language models. We are embodied souls. We have a spiritual dimension. We cannot and should not suppress our souls in deference to AI, particularly when it comes to life and death situations inherent in war. Taking a broad look at secular thought about this topic, note that autonomous weapons that operate with no human intervention are a major concern of those with deep knowledge of AI. One example is Geoffrey Hinton, the AI researcher from the University of Toronto, who was awarded a Nobel Prize for discoveries and inventions that enable machine learning with artificial neural networks. And that laid the groundwork for today's artificial intelligence. In various interviews and written materials, he has consistently cited autonomous weapons as a major concern. Here is one example of what he has said. I'm more concerned about autonomous weapons than about intelligent machines. They are a real danger. It would be awful to have someone like Hitler in charge of big fleets of small autonomous drones. We need new things like the Geneva Convention to limit the use of autonomous weapons. This excerpt from Magnifica Humanitas carries a similar message to that of Hinton and many others. The growing ease with which autonomous weapon systems can be deployed makes war more, quote-unquote, feasible and less subject to human control. This violates the principle that armed force should be used only as a last resort in cases of legitimate self-defense. So with Hinton and others calling for a ban on autonomous weapons, what can we do to address rogue actors who deploy AI without regard to international law, principles of justice, and human decency? So I won't get into too many details on this, but there's a great episode on this topic in the podcast, Your Undivided Attention, put out by the Center for Humane Technology. So they draw very much on parallels and differences with the nuclear arms race and discuss topics such as verification capabilities that are already built into the GPUs in AI data centers by companies such as NVIDIA. So this episode came out in June of 2026, and I highly recommend it if you'd like to take a deep dive on this topic. To provide some inspiration, an example of peacemaking happened in October of 1962. So during a tense and dangerous escalation in the Cold War between the USA and the Soviet Union, Pope John the 23rd sent a message to the peoples of the world and a letter to the Russian President Khrushchev with a call for peace and continued negotiations. And, this letter provided Khrushchev with the out he needed. In an unprecedented move for a state-run, strictly atheist, communist publication, the Soviet state newspaper Pravda ran the Pope's appeal on its front page, running the headline, "We beg all rulers not to be deaf to the cry of humanity." It signaled to the Soviet public that the international community, that a retreat would not be an act of cowardice. Instead, it would be a response to a global moral authority's plea for human survival. And, 2 days later, Khrushchev officially agreed to dismantle and remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba, and also a secret ingredient to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. So these negotiations between JFK and Khrushchev and their administrations were certainly helped on by this intervention from the Pope in some small but meaningful way. And what could have easily escalated into a nuclear conflict was avoided. So it's time to draw this to a close. So in conclusion, Pope Leo XIV has been quoting the "Blessed are the peacemakers" beatitude extensively. And this is certainly foundational in thinking about how just war theory is outdated in the age of modern weaponry and AI. So thank you for watching this video. I've hoped you found it helpful, and I encourage you to read through and reflect on Magnifica Humanitas if you have not already done so.